purpose of the assessment is eligibility for regional center. Regional center doesn't care about education. They just care about whether or not you have a developmental disability, one of the five. There's 5 different categories. And that disability requires them to need services. But nowhere in there does it say anything about education. So I believe that LEPs are probably the best suited to conduct these eligibility assessments because we know autism backwards and forwards. We know developmental disabilities backwards and forwards. Typically, when you are going through the assessment for a regional center, to be a regional center consumer, you're usually a school-aged child. So it looks like it fits, like it checks all of the boxes. But at the end of the day, we have regional center consumers that aren't on IEPs because they're not impacted academically. They might need adaptive training. They might need to have behavior support at home, those sort of things, which we still could identify because we're training how to do that. But the purpose of the regional center assessment is not academically based.
Welcome to the Empower LEP Collaborative Podcast, a podcast to empower, inspire, and collaborate with aspiring and practicing licensed educational psychologists and like-minded professionals. We're your hosts, Jana Parker and Bethany Zoeller, bringing professionals together to talk business, private practice, and find inspiration from our community. Welcome back, everybody, to the Empower LEP Collaborative Podcast. We are doing our second episode here with the king of LEPs, Chris Jones, but I am Jana Parker, and we have with us
Bethany Zoeller,
who sounds amazing because she got a great new microphone. So now we are very official. I feel like we've made it.
I feel like I should let our listeners know that I have discovered Jana's secret. And that is that she's a bit of a dance mom. All right. So we have to, there are standards. So I refer to her now as my dance mom with,
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So got to get the mic, got to get the lighting, got to get the, everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we just worked it out with Chris Jones and his son too.
Yes. We might need to bring Brady on as a subcontractor.
Brady is
for
available
lighting.
for work.
Yes.
Lighting, for sure. He knows a lot about it.
Well, Chris, thank you for coming back into the hot seat here with us. We really appreciate it, being the king and all. And we did kind of open up the questions because we had you on first to talk kind of about your LEP practice and get some insight from you in that realm. And we started dipping a little bit into Chris, the president-elect for CASP, and Chris, the president of BBS, and we dabbled. So, we'd like to ask you just more questions. I think there's this kind of movement right now towards people interested in using their LEP, which I think is amazing. And I also think that then it starts bringing up a lot of questions around things that really haven't been, I don't know, maybe issues before or brought up before or questioned before. And I think as the type A, like cross all our T's and dot all our I's people that school psychologists are, people are having a lot of questions. And so your job might get harder, but I think you're ready for it. I mean, you are the king.
I appreciate that. I don't know about the king, but
confidence.
Definitely play one on TV.
Well, apparently Bethany names everybody something.
I do. It's a thing. It's an issue that I'm going to work through with my therapist, the need to title everyone. Yes. But I will say, Jana, you're a dot our I's and cross our T's. I'm actually terrified to ask these questions because I don't want to know what the answer is. Right. We're going to dive into scope of practice today. And I'm kind of like, I like that. I don't ask for permission, ask for
forgiveness.
Forgiveness, not permission. That line, I like that. So, if you just see me crying in the corner of the screen as we go through this, I'm just processing. I'm processing the scope. So
I'm getting, and we can start there with scope of practice, but I kind of feel like it's like ed code. Like it's a little objective and a little subjective.
I would say yes. Chris is going to say no.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is, it is similar to ed code because the scope of practice for LEPs and for all 4 licenses that fall under the Board of Behavioral Sciences lives in business and professions code, right? So the code is the law, and how we interpret the code and put that code into practice as LEPs is our ethics. So there is interpretation of the law, and the way that we get precedent is when we have complaints. So sometimes the only way that we know what we're doing is wrong is that somebody makes a complaint against us for malpractice, for lack of a better term. That complaint goes to the board's investigation unit, and they investigate it. So typically what will happen if somebody files a complaint, then they will investigate. They'll look at the code that they feel is being violated, and then they will consult with myself as the LEP member on the board, and often with CASP, our ethics committee, or the LEP committee, which again is me, and a few other of our CASP friends, and they make a determination as to whether or not the code was violated. And if it was, then there's a penalty for that. So I don't always recommend asking for forgiveness versus permission in these cases because
Come on, Chris.
the board is tasked with consumer protection,
Right.
and
Yes.
we do take it pretty seriously.
Okay, so how many, I just am curious, like, do you get a lot of violations that you have to like investigate? Like, how often does it happen for LEPs? I'm sure for the board, but LEPs specifically, like, I want to know, what's the stats? Are we rule breakers?
I have not seen an LEP disciplinary case
Exactly.
in the 4 years that I've been on. Typically,
I'll be the first. Oh, wait.
So, but it's funny though, typically, because we see discipline cases. So when we see discipline cases on the board, it's because somebody's already been convicted of a wrongdoing, right? So we have to, so they go through a court proceeding. We have a judge that comes down from the Office of Administrative Hearings, and there is a deputy attorney general that comes in and prosecutes the case. So oftentimes what happens if there's a violation, then they enter into some sort of agreement. Sometimes it's a stipulated agreement. Sometimes it is a default agreement. Not really an agreement, but a default means that somebody has not responded to the complaint. The summons to come and have a hearing. And so if they are in default, we just take their license from them. Stipulated agreements are things that are negotiated. And then we have the standard, the uniform standard penalties for things. The most common, believe it or not, the most common violation that we see at the board that I see is DUIs.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. DUIs, it's amazing the number of people that don't push the little Uber button on their phone. If you get a DUI as a licensed person in California, then you are automatically put on probation from anywhere from 3 to 5 years. It is not a joke. And it doesn't matter whether that DUI occurred during work hours or if it was on the weekend. It has nothing to do with the profession. But the problem is that we are held as licensees, we are held to a higher standard than the public because it's our job to protect the public.
This is some mental health people that need some coping skills.
Yeah, typically that's what it is.
Yeah.
That's what we see the most of. And obviously if you're looking at like statistics, the MFTs and the LCSWs are the biggest portion of the Board of Behavioral Sciences. They each have over 40,000 licensees, and that doesn't even include the associates. So then there's the LPCCs. They're around, I think they're at like 5,000 at this point, and LEPs are around 2,000.
Man, wow, that's amazing. So we need to talk about scope so that I know all of the things that I should do. I am doing correctly is really what I want to know. Yes.
Sure. Okay.
Yes. Just you want to go over it? I don't know how we want to do this, or if I have specific.
I can run. I have the scope up. I can run through it.
Run through it.
It's pretty much anything that you do as a school psychologist, you can do as an LEP. You just do it in private practice. So educational evaluation, the big one is the diagnosis of psychological disorders that are related to academic learning processes. So this is where it differs from schools. As an LEP, you're not, you have a foot in both worlds. You have a foot in DSM, you have a foot in ed code. So if you're doing a private practice assessment that has nothing to do, like the parents aren't taking the report to school and you just want to use DSM, you're welcome to do that. Most LEPs, I don't think, do that because we're so trained in ed code, we might use both. But the diagnosis means that you can diagnose a client with attention deficit disorder, with autism, with DSM doesn't call it specific learning disability. They call it, reading disorder, writing disorder,
writing disorder.
Right. And the criteria is much more broad in DSM than it is in ed code for learning or disorders of learning. So if you have competence in a certain mental health area, you can diagnose, like if you're competent and trained in how to identify bipolar disorder or other mood disorders, schizophrenia, those things, you can diagnose that as an LEP. There's no limit on what you can diagnose other than what you are not trained to do. So we don't recommend that you go diagnose schizophrenia if you've never been trained on how to do that.
Sure.
So that is the big one. Then it's giving all of the different tests, administration of diagnostic tests related to academic learning processes, interpretation of those assessments, psychological counseling. So this is the other big thing that we have in our code versus the other 3 licensees. It's not called therapy. It is called counseling, psychological counseling for individuals, groups, or families. So that gives you the broad scope of being able to see families. You're not doing marriage counseling, but you can do family counseling with parents. I've done lots of sessions with just parents as they're coping with understanding their child's disability and how it impacts them both at home behaviorally and in school. So you link it all back to some sort of academic functioning, and then that falls within our scope. Consultation, assessments, as we spoke about before, developing treatment programs for strategies to address problems of adjustment and coordination of intervention services. So that's the scope of our practice. It is very broad, yet also narrow because it's limited to, academics.
So we can diagnose ADHD, autism, learning disorders, or anything else that we are specifically trained and competent in.
Mm-hmm.
Does the age of the individual that we're working with matter?
The age does not matter. What matters is the purpose of your assessment. So what are you assessing? What are you assessing for? Typically, we're 95%, I would say, of LEPs are probably working with school-age kids. So college counts, people who are in vocational programs count, trade schools. You have an adult that goes back to school or gets into a training program that's going to get them into a job. All of those things are within our scope. There's no limit on age. It's clearly about what the purpose of their of what it is that they're doing.
Okay. I'm not letting Jana talk, and she's supposed to be interviewing you, but I have another question.
It's okay.
Okay.
So the CASP FAQ for LEPs that's online,
Mm-hmm.
it actually has different wording than the scope, which is interesting. And so it says it is educationally or vocationally related. And so let's tell me about that. Like, do you feel like that's appropriate that it's there? Is it a misprint? Because I've always kind of run with that. And that to me, that's still a learning process, right? It's just now we're in the workforce. And so we might need accommodations and things like that at work. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think so Business and Professions Code says nothing about vocation or LEPs. I think that has been an interpretation. And the question would be, what is the vocation? Is it a vocational training program, or is it actually like sitting in an office and, doing your job? There is, if you think about it, right, we have to teach social skills to kids. And so if we've got adult clients that are possibly on the autism spectrum and they're struggling with the socialization at work and it's causing them to, have depression or anxiety, or could get them fired, one would think that might be within our scope of practice. But This is one of those kind of gray areas where we won't really know until somebody files a complaint and they do an investigation.
Gotcha.
Which is unfortunate. It's never really a great way to go. I would probably steer clear of vocational work just by itself. If there's not some sort of training element that is that is part of it.
Okay. So like I had an interesting case where it was an adult who had previously, like when he was in school, he was, I want to say, in his late 40s, early 50s. He had a diagnosis of dyslexia as a child, but he didn't have any of that paperwork anymore. And he was failing to meet the standards at the distribution center that he was working at because he couldn't read the content of, it was like packing manifests and stuff. He couldn't meet the speed requirement. And so we talked about it and I told him, hey, I'm an educational psychologist, but I really felt like it fit because it was still it was still that reading component. But was I out of line, or should I this is hypothetical. No, just kidding. It never happened. No.
This possibly could have happened somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
I think that's one of those gray area assessments. Okay. So if the purpose of the assessment is to provide accommodations in the workplace, like you're looking for a 504 plan for him, basically, then that would be a major life function that you are trying to support. I don't know that it is or isn't within our scope of practice. If you go by the letter of the law, it's probably outside the scope.
Okay.
But the purpose of doing that was to support him in a vocational program. And if that is part of the vocation they need to have accommodations, they're coming to you for that. That's could be within the scope. I think that would be up to debate with ethics committee. It wouldn't. I would never make that
it
call
never
by
happened.
myself.
Like it never really happened, so it's fine. I was just, a friend of a friend.
Sure.
Anyways,
sure.
The other one that we went toe to toe on the big bad social media is regional center. So let's chat. And sorry, Jana, I took over.
It's okay. I'll hold I have questions too, but I will hold it. It's fine. Yep.
Okay.
So the debate about whether or not LEPs should be assessing eligibility for regional center has been a long-standing argument. Like I said, I think I've told you guys, I had this conversation with the head of the state of California Regional Center assessment person. They called me. It was before pandemic. So everything was blurs before pandemic. So it was probably 7+ years ago. And we had conversations over the course of a few months going back and forth. And it was really, really good conversation about whether or not this was within our scope. So what it came down to was this. The purpose of the assessment is eligibility for regional center. Regional center doesn't care about education. They just care about whether or not you have a developmental disability, one of the 5. There's 5 different categories. Mm-hmm. And that disability requires them to need services. But nowhere in there does it say anything about education. So I believe that LEPs are probably the best suited to conduct these eligibility assessments because we know autism backwards and forwards. We know developmental disabilities backwards and forwards. Typically, when you are going through the assessment for a regional center, to be a regional center consumer, you're usually a school-aged child. So it looks like it fits, like it checks all of the boxes. But at the end of the day, we have regional center consumers that aren't on IEPs because they're not impacted academically. They might need adaptive training. They might need to have, behavior support at home, those sort of things, which we still could identify because we're trained in how to do that. But the purpose of the regional center assessment is not academically based. It's nothing to do with that. So the end around for that in our conversation was, well, we would have to have that component in there to make it something that would be within our scope. The assessment person said, well, that's not necessary for what our needs are. So no, we're not going to do that. And we agreed that LEPs probably was probably not within our scope of practice.
Interesting. Yeah, I always think of, I hadn't really thought about the early childhood assessments where they're looking at the 5 to see that early, what would that be? Part C of IDEA, where the 5 areas, right? Am I saying that right? Anyways, I was thinking more of when it's like that time to transition, when they usually do the full, like it usually goes to a clinical psychologist and they're doing that full assessment. But I get your point though, that the whole point is still eligibility for their services.
If you read any of we're regional center vendors. We do social skills groups for kids on the spectrum. We've been doing it for years. Anytime I would read a report from a clinical psych for regional center eligibility, never once did it have any academic functioning. It was a WISC, it was an ADOS, it was an ADI, it was a Vineland. That was the standard battery.
That's true.
So nothing, because it's not required. So that's not the purpose. The purpose of our assessments are for the diagnosis of psychological disorders related to academic learning process. So my thing is, if you can tie it in, then you're well within scope. Okay. But if you don't, then you're not. But that doesn't mean that we're not probably the best qualified to do it.
True.
Let me can I ask a question, just kind of not regional center related, but like kind of what you just said, like if you're doing an assessment, say for autism spectrum, and you are just doing something like you just said, a WISC, a ADOS, a Vineland, and ADI, right. That is, unless you throw something academic in there, you shouldn't be doing it.
Right. Or so, if you don't necessarily have to do academic testing to make it school related.
Right.
You can talk about social functioning within a school, because school is a kid's job. Like they have to be there. So maybe they're not concerned about their ability to read, write, and do math, but part of academic functioning has to do with being able to function within a classroom, within whatever educational setting you're in. Not every kid, is in a brick and mortar class. So if you can, tie it together, then you can relate many things with school-age children back to education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes people this is totally hypothetical, but what if let's say the kid is 9, brilliant, all academics are stellar, but parents think they might have ADHD. You're looking at ADHD, I think that as school psychologists, we get in the habit of doing a psychoeducational evaluation, like we do all the components of it. But if there are no issues with their academic achievement, I think I hear you saying like, okay, you might not actually have to do an academic achievement test, but the purpose of your evaluation should not necessarily just be to see if they have ADHD, but to talk about how their ADHD impacts them in the classroom, even if it's not a standardized test. Because I think like we do get a lot of referrals, not a lot. Most of the time we're doing like a full battery. But like sometimes in my clinic, we're like, do we have to do everything? Like, is it within our scope to not do every piece of this? Like that's a question that's come up before.
You don't. So the short answer is no, you don't. I've done many assessments over the years, specifically just for ADHD, without doing any academic testing, because the referral question becomes, does the child have ADHD, and what can we do to support them in school? Academically, they're fine, but they have no friends, or they can't sit still, or this or that. So part of my assessment is classroom observation, talking with the teachers, getting behavioral data from them, looking at the impact. Maybe the answer isn't an IEP, maybe it's a 504 plan, or it's simply just offering support. So the nice thing about being an LEP and the difference between us, LEPs and typical school psychologists, is we can be proactive as an LEP. You don't have to wait for a student or a client, whoever, to fail or to be failing in order to intervene.
Right.
You can do all of those things if they're worried that, hey, we're concerned that something may happen. We're seeing some anxiety. It's not impacting them yet, but it could. So can we assess and evaluate and determine how we can treat that treat the drip before it becomes a busted pipe?
Right.
So a lot of preventative work. And that was one of the big driving forces that made me quit my job and start my practice. It was because I felt special education in general was often very reactive. And I saw opportunity to provide supports and interventions that would have been considered very least restrictive before the problem became bigger. So let's fix it when it's small. And that way we don't have to go through months or years of trauma and have this kid be successful and happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a misnomer that we have to wait for kids to fail to come in and save the day.
Preach.
Yeah. That's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
I mean, and it also just makes me think about when, like school psychologists, because even in school psychology, I think it's sometimes misunderstood that just because a student may score well on an achievement test with ADHD does not mean that their ADHD is not impacting them educationally.
Right. The kids that aren't turning their homework in, or doing their homework and not turning it in,
right,
and not getting credit for it. There's so many other pieces that come into play.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the impact of any disability on students, achievement within school.
Right. Thank you. All right. I feel good about that answer. Bethany, do you have any more follow-ups to that question?
No, I think just a comment is that when we look, because we're LEPs, we are utilizing the DSM criteria. And so I don't feel in my practice that I need to do academic testing unless the DSM is telling me that I have to do it. You know what I'm saying? So like autism, like I'm going to do it if there's an academic concern, but that's not necessarily autism, right? I'm going to look at social and communication and those sort of aspects of it. So yeah, I actually feel better. I'm glad Chris came. I was afraid I was going to be off in the corner, but so far I'm okay. Other than
You're
that
not going to jail.
Didn't happen, but I mean, it could have happened. Like, it was good. It's good.
As long as you connect the dots to education.
Oh, yeah. I am great at rationalizing my behavior. So don't even worry. Like it's a skill set that I have. Yes. I'm trying to remember, Jana, what were the other questions that we got from people that wrote in?
So one of them asked about the test for LEPs. And, Chris, we know you do not write the test. You do not know much about the test, but I think the nature of the question was like, I think just kind of asking like, how is this, how did you come up with this? And I will tell you, as like someone who has a test prep course that people, can purchase and go through, and like all of the chatter that goes on the Empower LEP Facebook group, just about aspects of the test, some people are finding it very, very challenging. And I know that when you and I spoke about it, you said, it's really supposed to be for the beginner LEP coming in, like you're not supposed to have like all the answers. But I think that the way that the questions are worded and how tricky it becomes to be like, well, that's the biggest thing people say is like, what's the first thing you're supposed to do? Or like when all of the answers seem like they could potentially be right, so why is it so tricky? Why is it so tricky? And why isn't there more of like a study guide that BBS puts out with a little bit more guidance, more than just, the different aspects, which we all can get on the BBS website? What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, what BBS has told me when I first started putting my own test prep workshop together was that your knowledge as a school psychologist should be sufficient enough for you to pass the exam. So, I can run through how the exam is developed. It's not rocket science on how this is done. So what happens is about every 10 years, BBS does what's called an occupational analysis, which is research to determine what LEPs are actually doing in the field. So typically the majority of our work is assessment. Now that may evolve and change over time as more LEPs are in practice and we have a bigger pool to survey to determine what it is that they're doing. So once that occupational analysis is completed, then that kind of determines what the test is going to be made up of. So when you turn your application in and you get that handbook that comes in the mail, you can actually access it online anytime that you want. It will tell you the percentage of what is going to be given on the test. And typically like 40% of the test is assessment. So they break it down into the different areas that's within our scope of practice, and we go from there. Then what BBS does is they get subject matter experts to come up to Sacramento. Now, subject matter experts are LEPs. LEPs that may be in practice, they may be retired, and they come up and a few, I think about 3 or 4 times a year, that they come up to Sacramento and they get in a room and they write the test questions. So these are questions that are written by LEPs. Now they may not, write all of the, multiple choice answers and things like that. There's a whole department within the Board of Behavioral Sciences that manages the exams for all 4 licensees. So once they write those test questions, then they get thrown into the exam as to test them out, to test the questions, to see how well they work. So that's why there's 125 questions on the LEP exam, but only 100 count. 25 of them are test questions to determine, so when old questions need to cycle out, they can put the new questions in. So they test those questions to see how well they do in practice. You don't know which ones they are, though. They don't tell you which ones are the practice ones and which ones are the real ones. So you just kind of have to go with it. And then from there, they create there's different versions of the test. And I think I don't know how many different versions there are. And some are weighted a little bit differently. They're all similar in difficulty, but some are a little bit harder, some are a little bit easier. And so they use a criterion-based method of analysis to figure out what the passing score is. So BBS wants you to pass the test. You are a revenue stream for the Board of Behavioral Sciences. They want you to be able to practice. We have a shortage of mental health professionals in the state of California. We want this to be as easy, streamlined process as possible. So, but we're also tasked with consumer protection. So the test itself is to evaluate the minimal competency of somebody to practice safely in the state of California. So that's where, some people have a really hard time. I'm a terrible test taker. Test taker. I was shocked that I passed the LEP the first time I took it. I literally hit that button, got the answer, and slid back from the table and went, yes, and then realized that I was in a room full of people taking tests and had to quiet myself down. So, I was literally shocked. The board is also looking at alternative ways of determining minimal competency other than standardized tests. Oh. At this point, standardized tests are what we have, but the other licenses are licensed. The other the other three licenses are having difficulty to passing the exam. Sometimes it's training programs. Sometimes it's, I'm just not a good test taker. Sometimes it's I'm not prepared enough. But, the goal is to make sure that we can get California more mental health professionals to support our consumers. But we have to make sure that, they're safe to practice.
Yeah.
It's a process.
Yeah. That's harsh. I was like, oh, it's just, I remember taking the test and being so thankful that my experience as a school psychologist was as abnormal as it was, and that I contracted with so many different school districts and had seen things so many different ways. And I remember, I spent the time right before I took the test, I had a big contract with a high school. And I remember walking out of that test and going, oh my gosh, the only reason that I think I really passed is because I had that high school training that did so much of the transition to adult stuff, which prior to my time in high school, I would have never known anything about. And so I can see people's frustration if they haven't had that robust of an experience, because, I was in the elementary school, I did this. And so you don't necessarily know about all those adult services that you got to be aware of as an LEP. So
yeah, I remember on my test, there were questions about people, like there were geriatric questions. I'm like, what does this have to do with LEP? But it does, because there's no age limit to our scope of practice. If you do fail the test, you get a score report that tells you how close you were, what sections you passed, which ones you didn't. So it gives you a study guide to figure out where you need to study harder, where you need to brush up on. I recommend people know the big tests, know some of the details. You don't have to know, the reliability, coefficient and all of those things, but, have an understanding about what different types of tests are, what they do, understand consultation. The biggest problem for people, Jana, you may be able to, to speak to this too, is one of the things that school psychs have the hardest time with is shifting their thinking from being a school psychologist to being someone in private practice. When you take the test, you have to think like you are in private practice. And every time I do my test prep workshop, I can't emphasize that enough.
Yep.
And then I get people that come back to me and they go, Chris, that was the best advice. Or the ones that come back and go, Chris, I didn't listen to you, and I took it as a school psychologist and I failed. I go, well, that's why you can take it again.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. I get that too. That's like my main message as well. Yeah. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, because we're going to run out of time and I don't want to do that. Were there any other questions that we got from the public that you wanted to take a stab at?
There was. Now you're going to make me look at it.
Well, what did you want to do, the Larry P one?
Oh, I can do the Larry P one. Sure.
Okay.
I can
so
do
the question was, what do you see going forward as best practice when doing cognitive assessments for African-American students in light of Larry P? And actually, in one of our, Kristen McKenna gave us a really good little, I think she's been doing a lot of work on this, and you probably have been working closely with her on that. So
we have a whole task force.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's 5 or 6 people that are involved. Right. So CAS put out a position or a guidance document at our October convention that was the culmination of a year's worth of meeting with CDE over the Larry P, because they put a memo out a year or so ago that basically said, ignore all other memos that that CDE has put out, and we are going back to the original ruling of Larry P. So move forward with that. It was super vague. So we met with them, multiple times over the course of the year. They had a change in special ed, in the state special ed director in the middle of our talks. So things really got muddled. But we had a final meeting with them in August. And at that meeting, we were kind of going back and forth about what are the next steps. And CDE was being very vague about what their position was. And it was this back and forth. And if you don't know me very well, I'm a very direct person, sometimes to a fault. But at one point, somebody on the call said, "Are there any specific questions?" And I said, "Yes, I have a specific question. I need to offer guidance to not only our membership, but to the school psychologists in California." I said, as a school psychologist, can we administer IQ tests to African American students as part of a larger assessment battery, as long as we are not trying to identify intellectual disability? And the answer was, you should refer back to the memo. It was very.
So if you're listening, he was nodding his head as he's saying that. So
yeah, he's nodding his head as he's saying, you should refer back to the memo. So I wasn't getting the straight answer, but that was about as straight of an answer as that we were going to get. So CASP drafted that document. We dropped it at convention, and if you were there, it was bombshell. It was fantastic. It got so much conversation happening, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to open the conversation because Larry P is a 50-year-old ruling, and CDE overreached with how they determined that it should be implemented. The original Larry P ruling simply stated you cannot use a single instrument to identify an African American student as being, at that point it was EMR, right? The equivalent of that today is ID, for the purposes of placement in a special day class. Had nothing to do with the other 12 categories. So fast forward 50 years, we're better assessors. We use more than one instrument. If you really go back and look at the investigation, what happened 50 years ago was terrible. I mean, some of the people that were doing these assessments weren't even credentialed psychologists. They were simply dropping IQ tests on kids. If they didn't pass, they're putting them into special. It was awful, right? But now, what we believe to be true is that CDE has given us not the green light, but the okay to move forward with treating African American students like we would any other student. We're the only state in the union that does not allow for using IQ tests on African American students. With that being said, you just can't run out and start doing it, right? You have to do it with fidelity. You have to do it with training. You have to be conscious of the biases that are within any of the assessment tools that we use, and make sure that you're doing proper, thorough, ethically sound assessments. So moving forward, the direction or the guidance of CASP is simply refer back to your districts and see what they're okay to do with. The districts are talking to their attorneys. The attorneys are saying, don't do it because you're going to put yourself, at risk of a lawsuit. So we interpreted our meeting with CDE as they're not going to come after you anymore if you use an IQ test on an African American student. And so move cautiously, move with fidelity, go with training, talk to people, have conversations, and start to, you can start to do this. So some districts are doing it, many are not at this point. I would do it if my charter was okay with it. And I think they would be okay with it if the attorneys said, go for it. They would be like, great, let's do it. But nobody wants to stick their neck out and be the first one to test this.
Yeah, none of the attorneys want to be the first to go through that. But so that would only happen, though, if somebody got sued and that was part of it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And most parents are upset that they don't get the test.
Yeah.
Not the other way around. So I'm like, I don't know who these people are that we think are going to get upset about their kid being treated just like everybody else. It's usually the other way around.
It is a very deep-seated issue. We're talking about 2 generations worth of this law being in place, and making a blanket fundamental change doesn't sit well. Change is difficult for people.
Sure.
So it's about how can we start to come back to the center on this. And so CASP, we have a task force. We're working with State SELPA. We are working with different parent groups. We are trying to talk to anybody and anyone who will listen and come to the table so that we can kind of work out the different issues and provide guidance and support for our membership.
Thank you.
I think LEPs have a different way that we could interact with this too, though, in that we have IEEs, so that there isn't somebody over us. There isn't necessarily an attorney telling us we can or cannot do this. So I've had one set of IEEs that I came back from CASP and I was I'm ready. I'm going to do this. I'm going to give everybody an IQ test. And I had 4 IEEs, and 3 of which would have been appropriate, African-American students. And the district flat out told me, even as an independent evaluator, that I couldn't do it, that it was part of their, which I didn't see the settlement.
They are correct. You cannot.
Yeah. So we can't do it because that's what the district, okay.
Right.
That's what
no, as an independent assessor, right, you are doing a school-based assessment. This is not a private assessment. This is a school assessment that you are doing as an independent evaluator.
Okay.
So you still fall under DSM does not matter on IEs. You are using Ed Code 100%.
I know, but what I'm saying is, if we're getting the green light to do these tests as for psychoeducational assessments, should we as LEPs be kind of the forerunners of being okay, I have an IEE, it's an African-American student. CDE doesn't care if I give this test to him anymore. Or do we need to follow?
You have to follow the district rules.
Whatever the district rule is. Okay. That's good to know.
I've assessed many African-American students in my private practice with IQ tests over the years.
Sure.
I always give parents the disclaimer. If you are going to take this to school, we cannot do IQ tests.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah.
I just wondered if we would have an extra way of getting it in there, but
no,
okay.
In fact, we had I was in a meeting a year or so ago where a private assessor came in and had given an African-American student the WISC and used it to identify a learning disability. And and maybe it wasn't even the whole WISC. I can't even remember what it was. So this was a couple of years back, right? Before CDE had drafted their memo and all that stuff. And so I'm reading the report, and I knew the assessor, and I'm looking at it, I'm going, you didn't do that. Tell me you didn't do that. And so when she got down to the part of eligibility, and it was specific learning disability, and I said, I'm sorry, we can't consider this part of your report. And well, why not? Because of the Larry P.
Right.
And she said, well, I'm an independent person. I said, it doesn't matter. The law is that you cannot use IQ tests to identify a disability for an African-American student. Well, going back and forth. So then I had to get all lawyerish on her. I said, did you use an IQ test? Yes. Did you use that IQ test as a way of identifying a learning disability? Yes. Then this is where the conversation ends.
Yeah.
The parent was so not happy.
Is it the law though, or is it just the preference of the school district?
It's actually not a law at all. I forget what the right terminology is. It's a CDE
guidance.
Not even guidance. It's their rule. It's a CDE rule. So the law was overturned in 1996. Not the whole law, just so the original ruling was ID or EMR. Then the courts expanded it to everything. Then they came back off of that and went back to ID. CDE said, I don't care what the court says. It's everything. All 13 categories, can't do it. Can't do it. So even though the law says that you can, CDE supersedes that because they can come in and ding you for it because you're breaking one of their rules. So it gets really muddy.
What about going back to just DSM diagnoses on an IEE? Your thoughts there?
Well, tell me where DSM diagnoses live in Ed Code.
Well, they don't, but let's just say,
Then it doesn't happen.
but so, now we have a bunch of LEPs doing IEEs, but you have lots of clinical psychologists or neuropsychologists doing IEEs for districts. I've been on the receiving end of those, right? And they always have clinical diagnoses on them. So we put clinical diagnoses on them and ed code.
Yes, do both.
Yeah,
I do both.
Okay.
I would do both. Yeah.
But
sometimes it does relate to ed code, though. I mean, when you think about it, we can give the diagnosis of ADHD for OHI. We could give the diagnosis of anxiety disorder for ED. So, I mean, I always just kind of feel like it's a service to the family. It's like one less hoop they have to jump through. But yeah,
I will typically do that also. Like if I'm doing an IEE, I'm typically using both. I put ed code first,
right,
and then DSM second.
Okay, I just want to make sure because we're doing that too, but I want to make sure it's okay.
This is one of the reasons that LEPs are the most qualified to do IEEs. A lot of times attorneys will want someone, they have a PhD, they have, their doctorate level, whatever. But, they come in and, we've diagnosed you with a DSM reading disorder. Well, great. Can you show me that data? Well, they got an 88 on reading fluency. So therefore it's a reading disorder. Sorry, that doesn't meet ed code, criteria. Right. Well, what do you mean? Well, it just doesn't. It's not, right. They don't have the educational training that we do. So that's why LEPs truly are the most qualified to do IEEs, regardless of whether you're doctorate level or not. We have that. We live in the world of education, and that's why LEPs are so important when it comes to doing IEEs. I think we do a better job anyway because we speak the language.
Yeah.
We go into the schools, we understand the systems. We can come in and bridge that gap between, a parent who's upset because they don't feel the district did their job. You can come in and go, okay, well, let me interpret what that means. When the district did this, this, and this, let me tell you what that means.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you can oftentimes help mend that relationship. I've done that. I mean, a lot of districts will hire me because I'm a lot cheaper than them going to due process.
Right.
They know that I'm going to come in, I'm going to give them an honest answer. And if they're not doing their job, I'm going to tell them, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm also going to provide resources and recommendations on how we can make this better.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, I feel like we could talk to you for a very, very long time. But
so we'll see you next month.
Right.
the monthly podcast with Chris Jones.
Right. I mean, we have to wrap up here, but thank you for coming on again and for really being a leader in our field, kind of overall. So, we're really excited that you're going to be the president of CASP soon, and you've done an amazing job so far, just advocating for us and supporting us and helping us learn and grow. I think it's a really exciting field. And, as president of BBS, you're wearing two very, very important hats. And I don't know how you do all that with a full-time job and a private practice. I mean,
me either. Smoke and mirrors.
But thank you very much for coming on and talking with us again.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Empower LEP Collaborative Podcast. Episodes can be found at empowerlepcollaborative.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to be a guest on our show, or if you have any questions for us, don't hesitate to connect. We would love to learn more. Jana can be found at jana@empowerlep.com, and Bethany can be reached at bethany@lepcollaborative.com.